everybody, I'm Brian, and today we're going to clear up a few things about Wi-Fi. The tricky thing about Wi-Fi is that it can be hard to tell the difference between one router and another for the features, or one access point and another, and that advanced settings page for Wi-Fi can seem like a dangerous place. But a little knowledge goes a long way, and I'm here to hook you up. So stick around as we break down some of the basics of Wi-Fi. Let's get into it. The first thing I think we should clear up is the whole name thing. You see, Wi-Fi doesn't actually stand for anything. It's not an initialism or anything like that. They just thought it sounded cool. Like, for real. In fact, the name comes from and is part of the Wi-Fi Alliance, which is an industry organization and not part of the IEEE standards board. In fact, the second part of the whole confusion about the names thing is that if you have been messing around with Wi-Fi for more than a few years, you probably remember that it used to go by letters, right? Once upon a time, there was 802.11a, b, g, n, a, c. Those letters come from the IEEE standard. These are all part of the 802.11 subgroup of standards that are all about Wi-Fi. But about the time of 802.11ac, the Wi-Fi Alliance decided they didn't like the sound of those letters anymore, and that they caused confusion, and I suspect they wanted people moving on to bigger number. And so, yeah, they instituted this idea of numbering instead. And so 802.11ac sort of retroactively started getting branded as Wi-Fi 5. Why 5? Well, because A, B, G, N, and AC, right? I've seen some branding for Wi-Fi 4 or N. I've never heard about Wi-Fi 1 through 3 getting branded because you're not going to buy those things anymore. All right. The next standards that came out after that are referred to often as Wi-Fi 6 and 7, but honestly, I think we really missed out, because Wi-Fi 6 is also known as 802.11ax. Man, we could have had a whole bunch of products axe themed, or with axe puns all over the place, but 6, why not? Wi-Fi 7, by the way, also known as 802.11be. They actually looped around the whole alphabet, right? A, B, G, and right, there are other standards along the way as well that weren't referring to speeds. When they hit the end, they looped around and started doing 2 letters, hence AX. There were a bunch of other A something else before that. And by the time they got around to BE, again, there were a bunch of other little addendums to the standard that weren't related to speed, but BE. Okay. So this is the whole thing with Wi-Fi naming. If you hear about these numbers, they still correspond to some letters, but it's fine. Don't worry about it. The next thing that we need to make sense of is the whole gigahertz thing. Yeah, if you've been playing around with Wi-Fi for even a few minutes, you might have heard of 2.4 gigahertz or 5 gigahertz, and now maybe even 6 gigahertz. Okay, so the first thing you need to know about it is that is not the speed we're talking about. It's the frequency range. It's more like the channel we're tuning into, or even more, the radio we're using. Yeah, because forever you've had 2.4 and 5 gigahertz on your Wi-Fi, and that's literally 2 radios with different sets of frequency. Again, the bigger number is not inherently faster. It doesn't make it faster or anything. But for odd policy reasons, kind of weird, it kind of means that anyway. It's weird, right? Higher frequency doesn't actually necessarily yield higher speed, but basically because of the channels available and because of like some practical implementation reasons, sometimes, very often even, those higher numbered channels will yield you more speed. But we'll get into it, I promise. So here's the deal. When we're using Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, we're basically operating our own tiny little radio stations, just at really short range. And to do that, we have to have Radio frequencies are ranges of the electromagnetic spectrum that are not otherwise in use by, businesses or governments or whatever. And so most governments set aside ranges of the spectrum for unlicensed space. For instance, the 2.4, 5 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz. But even more specifically, it's not like 2.40, 5.0, 6.0. It's 2.4 to a little less than 3 gigahertz. It's 5 through not quite 6 gigahertz, and then again, 6 gigahertz through not quite 7 gigahertz. There are usually other ranges of the spectrum that are unlicensed as well, but they haven't really been considered as useful for Wi-Fi so far. Okay, so in Wi-Fi, there are a bunch of different channels, and it's a little chunk of space. The standard basic Wi-Fi channel is 20 megahertz wide. Don't get too hung up on that, but basically what it comes down to is that in that 2.4 gigahertz range, you have 3 usable channels, generally speaking. In Japan, maybe there's kind of sort of a fourth, but generally speaking around the world, 3 usable channels where they don't overlap, and you have those 20 megahertz wide chunks. Okay, over in the 5 gigahertz space, you've got about 20 channels. It's a little wibbly wobbly because it depends on where you're at in the world, which exact version of Wi-Fi you're using, and honestly, like where you are in your town. If you're near ground-based radar, like I actually am, you can't use about half the channels, not reliably. And then there's 6 gigahertz, which is a dream. And maybe you can dream it, and maybe you can't. It kind of depends. So 6 gigahertz is a huge chunk of spectrum, and it's this unlicensed space. But there's more channels, say, in the US than there are in the EU, because about half the channels are approved in the EU as opposed to the whole set in the US. But even then, you got to be real careful. Gosh, there's just a lot more rules that get implemented in it to make sure that your equipment is not overlapping with other stuff that might be using it. And so a lot of Wi-Fi 7 devices aren't shipping with 6 gigahertz radios. Or for that matter, I should say even Wi-Fi 6, because 6 gigahertz came out for Wi-Fi 6 and 7, AX and BE. But it's not always implemented because of the extra work that has to go into making sure that that no one else that's more important than us over on Wi-Fi is there. And so if it detects that, it kicks you off those channels. Okay. But maybe up to about 50-ish channels. Okay, so we got these 3 ranges, and while the gigahertz number being bigger isn't what makes it faster, there are 2 reasons that those higher frequency channels, 5 and then 6 gigahertz, are actually likely gonna be faster in practice. And it comes down to, like I said, 2 things. The first is something called channel bonding, which is really freaking cool. So we said a second ago, 20 megahertz wide is a normal channel. But if you go into the advanced settings on your router or access point or whatever, you might see a setting in there for 40 or 80 or 160 or maybe even 320 megahertz. And it's not suddenly talking about this other thing you got to deal with. I thought we were doing gigahertz. It's how wide the channel is. How many channels are bound together. Yeah, and so what that means is basically that you can now send more information at once if your computer, if your access point, home router or whatever, both support it. Then these wider channels mean that you can transmit a whole lot more information at one time. And number 2 for the higher channels, or rather higher frequency channels, you're a bit less likely to have to share those channels, to be congested, of having you and your neighbors on the same channels as each other. And it just comes down to the number of channels available, right? There are more, generally speaking, actually always, there are more channels available in the 5 gigahertz space than the 2.4, just because more frequency is set aside for it. There's more up in the 6 gigahertz than the 5 as well, right? More channels. And so you're more likely to be able to not be on the same channel as your neighbors, and more likely to be able to get away with channel bonding. And that channel bonding, basically getting a little more into that, is the last thing I want to get into today. So, on the 2.4 gigahertz space, do not do channel bonding. If you see subsetting in there for the 2.4 gigahertz, leave it on 20 megahertz, because there are 3 channels, 1, 6, and 11. Yeah, basically, there's a whole bunch of numbers 1 through 11, but most of the channels being 20 megahertz wide overlap with each other. 1, 6, and 11 are non-overlapping. And if you try doing 40 megahertz in the 2.4 gigahertz space, well, cool, that's 1 and 6. Or it's 6 and 11. And so that means almost certainly you're going to have a neighbor on one of those channels in your way. And also, right, no man spreading. You don't need to take up all that extra space. It's not going to do you much good anyway. So for channel bonding up at the 5 gigahertz space, let's talk about what you could get away with. Okay, if you are running Wi-Fi 5 or newer AC, then you have access to those 40 megahertz or more channels bound together. And depending on what you're doing, where you're living or working, I would recommend different numbers here. If you are setting things up for a business in an office, then you are going to do 40 megahertz channels, even if you're on the latest version of Wi-Fi, probably over in the 5 gigahertz space. And the reason is you don't want to eat up those channels too fast. Even if you own the whole building, you're going to have a ton of access points all over the place, and you want the different ones near each other to be in different channels. And so that's why you're not going to go any wider than 40 megahertz. If you are living in an apartment complex, then 40 megahertz shouldn't be any problem in the 5 gigahertz space for Wi-Fi 5, 6, or 7 on the 5 gigahertz space. But in an apartment complex, you might consider doing the 80 megahertz channels. It just depends on how busy things are. Give it a try, see if it's better. If you find that your Wi-Fi is worse, things are a little bit slower, knock it back down to 40 megahertz. You just got all your neighbors are on channels all around you. You might be able to use something like Wi-Fi Analyzer on your phone. Have a second. And the thing that this might be helpful for is just to see where there is channel space available. It might be that you just need to switch to a different channel and you're golden. Maybe everybody's sitting on the same channels as you, and that's the only problem. Anyway, so in the 5 gigahertz space in an apartment complex, you can probably get away with 80 just fine. If it turns out no one of your neighbors have 5 gigahertz, that'd be weird. Maybe even go wider. Okay, for the Wi-Fi 6 and 7, 6 introduced 160 megahertz channels, 8 channels bound together. And if you live in a house, not an apartment complex, then you might be able to get away with that. It just kind of depends. It also depends on where in the world you live. So I actually live just by chance near ground-based radar. And so I can't use about half of the 5 gigahertz channels at my house. Not reliably, because ground-based radar uses that middle chunk of 5 gigahertz space. And so for me at my house, 80 megahertz channels are the way to go. I just don't have the room here. Me and my neighbors are all crammed in about half of those 5 gigahertz channels. If you can't see your neighbors, right? If you're getting out the binoculars to look at the neighbor's house in the distance, man, okay. Knock yourself out with whatever you want to get away with. You're going to be perfectly fine with those 160 megahertz channels here. Okay, over in the 6 gigahertz space. 6 gigahertz, one of the biggest advantages of that is it's not very common. Right now, flip side, it's not common because it's expensive. But if you've got a home router access point with 6 gigahertz space, and heck, we'll go back to it, full-on access points, and you're in a corporate environment, you are probably going to be using 80 megahertz channels. Depends on where you are, how dense things are. If you're in the EU, maybe you consider 40 megahertz channels. But for most places in the world, probably you're good with 80 megahertz channels in the 6 gigahertz space, even in fairly dense environments. Going back to an apartment, 80 megahertz for sure should be fine. Probably most of your neighbors don't have it anyway. You might be able to get away with 60 or even 320 megahertz. Yup, 16 channels bound together. Probably not. but you might get away with 160, maybe, for now, till your neighbors get it. Going back to a house, yep, very, very likely in like a neighborhood or whatever, 160. And man, if you can't see your neighbors with a binocular, yeah, 320 megahertz, no problem. But also, put on your pants. Your neighbors don't need to see that with their binoculars. Oh my God. Okay, recap time, everybody. The naming of Wi-Fi. You might hear about it as a number. You might hear about it as a letter. Just two different systems, right? Most of the time, and for marketing purposes, now you're going to see that that number. The current version is Wi-Fi 7. Previous was 6. They're also known as 802.11be, and then before that, AX. All right, the gigahertz. The higher number is not technically better, but practically it kind of is. But it refers to different radios. You're going to check your access point or your home router. If it refers to itself as a dual radio, that means almost certainly 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. If it refers to itself as tri-radio or maybe triple radio, 2.4, 5, and 6 gigahertz is what you got there. And the channels. The individual channels are going to be 20 megahertz on one of those three radios, and then within that radio, they can be bound together potentially. 2.4 gigahertz, don't do it. 5 and 6 gigahertz radios, yeah, no problem. 40 megahertz for sure, depending on your environment, maybe a whole way up to 160 or 320 for Wi-Fi 6 and 7. And again, do something like Wi-Fi Analyzer on Android for free. Sorry, iPhone, it's kind of locked down. You got fewer options there. But that should help you see what channels are available to tell your home router or whatever to get onto the available empty space that your neighbors aren't already on. Okay, everybody, this has been a blast. Do me a favor, drop some questions in the chat down there, right? Maybe you've run into some problems lately and you're trying to make some sense of things. Also, I'm putting together, I think the next video is probably going to be one on setting up your home network for better game streaming. If you got some questions about that, or if there's something you've been trying that you're banging your head on, it's not working, drop it onto the chat. Let's see if we can work that into the next video. Meantime, I'm Brian. This has been a blast. We'll see you next time. Hey everybody, this has been amazing. Y'all are just a blast to hang out with, but I gotta get out of here. I gotta go home and tell my Wi-Fi lover. It's a pun.